Welcome back, everybody, to what I guarantee will just absolutely be another one of my videos. So I've had Scott Adams on my mind for the last few months for reasons that probably aren't foreign to you all. He had that strange kind of conversion to Christianity where he told Christians he was going to get around to it and then passed shortly after that. I was going to do a response to that and I had it all completed, but I didn't release it because the day I was going to release it, he passed, and that felt like kind of unfortunate timing. And I just went the route of caution and didn't release it. Hey, just cutting in for a quick update. I did end up doing a delayed release of that video yesterday. Thought the timing was a little bit better, and I thought it might make a decent companion to this video, so go watch that if you want. Links in the description. He also became problematic in other ways. So as somebody who used to read him a lot when I was younger, I just wanted to go back and see, what was his work like? What does it look like now in hindsight? And how does his writing back then connect to the kind of person that he seemed to have become? So today I'm just going to look at a few of his strips and react to them and give some of my commentary. So I hope you enjoy that. So before we dive into the comics themselves, I want to take another minute to establish a little bit more of the context of this whole thing and what I intend to do here. I could see this being taken, whether you like the idea or not, as a hit piece where I'm trying to go through Adams' old work and intentionally dig up examples of him being some kind of horrible racist. And so we can all laugh at him or shame him because that's what he was like. That's not what I'm trying to do. Make no mistake, I do not like Scott Adams. I think he became a horrible person, maybe always was, and said some really horrible things. But what I am doing is more out of a sense of personal curiosity. I want to understand to what degree he was always the way he was toward the end and how that maybe was represented in his work. Also, looking back at his work, what does that tell me, if anything, about what our society was like at that time? What does it tell me about who I was as a reader at that time? As somebody who enjoyed his work to some degree, I had a mixed relationship with it. Did I enjoy things or even look past things that now, looking back, I would think are problematic? And what does that say about how all of our perspectives have evolved? Are there little bits of things in there that show that maybe Adams had some actual bigotries that he was holding back on and that, the rise of MAGA and everything allowed him to be more upfront about? I've already read through some of these comic books. I picked them at random, by the way, so I wasn't trying to target anything. I just went to a used bookstore and found some discounted books I was able to get on some credit I had there, including Shave the Whales, which does seem to include some at least casual satire or criticism of the environmental movement. Not sure whether he means that or if it's just a play on words, but there seems to be something there. Still Pumped from Using the Mouse, and also Casual Day Has Gone Too Far. Those second ones seeming to be more of a just general office humor thing, which it seems like he got more into as his strip went on. I think that's what he's most famous for. So I have already browsed through his work. I started off wanting to do a video on just whether he was ever funny. And that's another part I'm curious about here. Was his work ever really that funny? Were comics in general ever that funny? I legitimately am curious about that because they are kind of a relic. I'm going to go into that more as this video goes on. But I have glanced at them. I started making a spreadsheet of every comic in these 3 books by page number and position and categorize it by topic and everything. That became just an incredibly insane amount of work, as you might imagine. And so then I narrowed it down more to things that seem to reflect an opinion. And that's what gets this video where it is now. So I guess that's what I'm going to do. There are a lot of comics I'm going to cover here. I don't know that I'll go through all of them. They are sorted by topic. And so I'll just go through and talk about different things that seem to reflect his opinion on different issues. I think a lot of what he's saying can just be as simple as humor, but a lot of the comics do touch on different social issues. And I think it's worth looking at how that reflects his point of view on this and what maybe he thinks his audience's point of view is going to be. So what are the issues that surrounded him later on? I think most of you know to some extent, and I'm not a scholar on his life and where he went politically and socially, but I do know that he said some pretty horrifying things about Black people. He said that white people need to get the hell away from them. I think characterized them as a terrorist group. And he said previously to that he wanted to, or that he identified as Black or something, which is just some really weird and I think probably toxic sounding allyship. And then essentially his idea was they can't be helped. They're out to get us and we just need to put distance between us and them. Pretty rough stuff. On its face, it just sounds extremely horribly bigoted. But there's this weird combination of that and maybe trying to do right by them in a really obtuse way that I just find confusing. And I found that in his work, I'm going to say up front, even if I was trying to do a hit piece on him, his work is not suited to that. His opinions on things seem to be more complicated than you might think. And so I think that is going to be interesting to look at. Anyway, let's get into a few of his comics. Like I said, I sorted them by topic. And so I think the natural one to start with is just general prejudice and bigotry and see what his comics look like when he was addressing that. So here's our first one from Shave the Whales. We have what looks like a dinosaur saying, "Hi, I'm Bob. I called earlier about the babysitting job." The guy at the door says, "To be honest, we didn't know you were a dinosaur when you called." Bob said, "That's okay. I didn't know you were yuppie bigots." Now, already here, I think we're seeing difficulty in distinguishing just absurdist humor from what might be an actual opinion of Scott Adams, because a dinosaur showing up to somebody's house and, having to confront bigotry on those terms does just seem kind of goofy on its face. But if there is an actual opinion or through line in this one, it seems to be that, if you discriminating mean distinguish one type of person from another, you're not always doing it for bad reasons. Some people or, beings, since we're dealing with dinosaurs, are inherently different from others. And if you notice that difference and, try to protect your family accordingly, that means you're a yuppie bigot. Now, I will admit it is hard to read these comics with fresh eyes, knowing where Scott Adams was going to go eventually. But if there was an opinion in this one, it does seem to be that, sometimes a little of what looks like bigotry is warranted, and it's ridiculous to call people out for that if they feel like they have a good reason, especially when this seems to align very closely with where Adams went later on, where he just thought Black people are so inherently dangerous that white people need to get away from them. Anyway, let's look at our next one. This is from I'm Still Pumped from Using the Mouse. We have a rat. This character's named Ratbert. He kind of just hangs around Dilbert's house, I guess. He says, "Is it possible that you're prejudiced against rats because you once had a bad experience with a rat?" Dilbert says, "Just out of curiosity, what would be a good experience with a rat?" Ratbert says, "I believe I've been insulted," and Dilbert says that was kind of a good experience. Kind of weird. I don't see much in here other than just kind of, I don't know, lightheartedly playing with bigotry. Who knows? Maybe we're still having fun in this one. Then the next one, and this is a continuing strand. "I was wondering if we're a dysfunctional family," Ratbert says. Dilbert says, "You're not a family member. You're a rat who won't go away." Ratbert says, "Suddenly I have the urge to rob a convenience store." So I don't know. I could see this one joking with or maybe criticizing the idea that bigotry and racism contribute to crime by reducing it to someone makes a mean comment and then somebody decides just to go immediately commit a crime. And isn't that absurd? Therefore, racism, institutional or otherwise, doesn't cause crime. People maybe just use it as an excuse. I don't know. It's kind of a clunky comic. And, again, who knows whether he's just trying to be funny, but this feels a little off to me. So then the final strip from this storyline, Ratbert says, "If I don't get some love and support around here, I might turn to a life of heinous crime." So yeah, again, he seems to be wielding this as kind of an excuse that society gives you to just go commit crimes because, my family wasn't nice to me. I don't know. Tell me if I'm wrong. Let me know in the comments if I'm overreacting to this, but this just feels a little gross to me. Then he says, "Or worse, I could become a certified public accountant." At that point, Dilbert says, "Stop it, you're scaring me." And Ratbert says, "I'm good with numbers." So it seems like the ultimate punchline, at least in this strip, was being an accountant is worse than being a criminal. This shows where none of these comics, or not all these comics, are monolithic. There's this mesh of kind of social commentary and just kind of offhand jabs at, people that Adams might see a certain way from the workplace. So the more you read these, the more you recognize it's really hard to come up with any kind of really straightforward simplicity in these. So then our last one of these, there weren't a lot addressing bigotry. This one's from Casual Day Has Gone Too Far. "I've decided to sell the company for a huge profit. I found some very discriminating buyers. When you say discriminating, you mean they hate people from this country. Wally says, it's okay, we have laws to protect us." And these guys are Albanians, by the way. I think they're just supposed to represent, like a Baltic country. and they're supposed to be backward, and the strip makes fun of them. There's a whole thing there. He seems, I don't know, the strip seems to make fun of them and treat them as just like overseas trash. And I think there's maybe some inherent prejudice there, but hard to know what to make about that. That's a whole ongoing thing, a running strand throughout the strips, and it goes back and forth. I didn't want to dig too much into that. The Albonians say they're lazy, but at least they're funny, and the other one laughs. So this one mentions laws to protect against discrimination as if it's a good thing, it seems like, but it's interesting. The comic becomes interested in discrimination when it's another country potentially discriminating against what would include white Americans. And so I don't know. Again, is Scott Adams really saying that anti-discrimination laws are good? Is he really being selective and, when he cares about those laws? Or is this all just being goofy? And it's really hard to sort out. But, it's hard not to see some strands of opinion in there, especially considering how opinionated he ultimately became. So those strips were the only examples in all three books that I felt at least came closest to even peripherally dealing with racism or bigotry or whatever, addressing it head on in any way. There might have been others, but I missed them. So, so much for any potential hit piece, I guess, on race if you're digging through these books looking for that. You maybe can see some potential proto-racism in there, maybe with some offhand comments that seem to take it a little lightly, but it's very, very light, and I think you kind of have to read between the lines to see it, to be fully honest. Our next topic, though, is one he seems to have a lot to say about, and that's women in dating, and a lot of comics are about that one. So let's go through a few examples of those, starting with the Shave the Whales one. So first, we have Dilbert standing at a woman's desk. She's saying, well, I would date you, but frankly, I think of you as a boring and unattractive blob of organic matter. Final panel, so let's just be friends. This, like a lot of the ones about women and dating, can seem to just be a jab at what a loser Dilbert is, and I think that's often what he's going for. But tell me if I'm wrong in potentially seeing a little bit of incel energy here. That men just can't win. And maybe not in this comic, but as we go through these. In this one, she, just says she's disgusted by him and uses let's be friends as an excuse to blow him off. I don't know. I feel a little bit of an incel vibe in that, but let's keep looking through these. In this one, Dilbert's actually on a date. She says, thanks for asking me out. Would you like to see my operating manual? He says, operating manual? She says, it's an aid to men. It covers everything from buying flowers to opening doors. He looks in there and it says, looks like you're due to have your jewelry rotated. She says, every 30 days saves money in the long run. So I guess just generally women is gold diggers, and boy, aren't they just so expensive. They expect a lot out of men. Here, Dilbert's on a date again. He says, I like your dress. And he thinks women love flattery. He says, it reminds me of my favorite dishcloth. Uh-oh, wrong thing to say. Of course, I'm not talking about an ordinary dishcloth. Dig, he thinks. I'm talking about a truly fashionable dishcloth here. In fact, if I dropped Jell-O on my shoes, I'd leave it there all day rather than use your dress to wipe it up. And then it shows the table and him knocked over and says, some women just don't know how to accept a compliment gracefully. So, as with everything, I pick up mixed vibes here. This one seems pretty clearly about Dilbert being stupid, and, men can be kind of clueless, I guess, with women. Her response was pretty violent, but, I don't know if there's something in there that reflects his perception of women and how you kind of have to tiptoe around them. But this one was mostly about how dumb and clueless Dilbert was. Here's another one that's just totally about him being clueless. I can tell what my date is thinking by her body language. Her body is telling me let's cuddle by a fireplace. And then we see ultimately that she's revving up a chainsaw, and he thinks, I'll get some firewood, she says. So yeah, men are just clueless. If we're generalizing from Dilbert to men in general, if we're going to try to generalize anything from this comic, it seems to be Dilbert as a representation of men just, not knowing how to read women and take hints. There is kind of a disconcerting idea that women are this force of nature that you have to just really be careful around. And I don't know that that represents an opinion or something he's trying to express to other men, or maybe it's just, his general perception of them. Maybe dating's intimidating, relationships can be difficult, and all this kind of stuff is maybe a glance into his mind in his internal struggle over how to relate to women. I don't know. Hard to say. Anyway, this one, we have an old woman saying, men don't whistle at me anymore. I credit the women's movement for making men more sensitive to how whistling degrades women. Dilbert says, what's the climate like on your planet? So, but potentially, I guess, what would sound like a complaint against feminism and, women's rights movements in general, but it kind of turns on its head and ends up being about an old woman being clueless. So, I don't know. I brought it up because it at least touches on that commentary about feminists, and we'll see that later. But again, these comics are a little complicated. It's hard to get a totally clear read in some of them on what his actual opinion is. And his opinion just might be a little nuanced. And in many cases, he's just legitimately trying to be funny, which is the whole point, I guess. In this one, Dilbert's on another date. The woman says, what I look for first in a man is honesty. Dilbert says, okay, I'd like to skip this boring conversation and go smooch, which is probably a rated G version of, something else a man might say. Her eyes get really big and she says, I didn't mean honesty about relevant things. So we kind of have Dilbert again being a little clueless, maybe in that he's too honest, gets to the point in a way that's kind of tactless. But also I feel like there's kind of a, what do women really want? They say they want honesty, but when you're honest for real about actual significant things, then they don't want that. Aren't women confusing? I don't know. Here we have Dilbert saying about 400 women turned me down for dates this year. So I guess he asked out at least more than one a day. He says, I can only conclude one thing. Dilbert says, not enough quality women. And Dilbert says, sadly. So I guess I would take this as meaning to point to Dilbert's cluelessness. But it is interesting how much, incel energy is in a lot of these, whether it's what Scott Adams intends to suggest or whether he's making fun of incels, such as Dilbert apparently. So again, here we have Dilbert being kind of clueless. He says, so would you like to meet after work and go to dinner? She says, what kind of car do you drive? He says, ugh, you women are all so shallow. It should not make one bit of difference what kind of car I drive. She says, except that it will help me find you in the parking lot. But you could just stand on top of it and thump your mighty chest. So yeah, this this seems like a criticism of men saying that women are superficial. Scott Adams does seem to have this weird fixation on women that does, if you watch the run of it throughout this whole thing, seem a little combative, like there's an adversarial relationship and, he's just trying to figure them out. But there are times where he seems to poke fun at the men's side of it. Right here, I program my computer to analyze any situation and predict the female response. This should clarify a few things. I'll type in watch sad movie, result crying. Now I'll try receive flowers, result crying. Let's try date with Dilbert, result crying. Dilbert says, boy, the truth gets vicious when you corner it. So the last panel seems to be kind of a turnabout where it's a jab at Dilbert because, a woman would cry if she went on a date with him. But I find it a little interesting that this whole comic, for the most part, aside from that last turn, seems to be devoted to just that women cry all the time about everything. It's not super consequential, but I find it a little interesting. And then here we have a woman saying, I like a man who makes eye contact. He says, oh no, uncontrollable urge to look away. I've got to blink about 20 times. Why did she have to bring that up? I gasp, blink, 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 blink. She turns to the camera, even though it's not actually camera, and says, I love doing that. So again, men are clueless, but women toy with them. It does feel a little two-sided the way he represents these, but again, it seems very much to come from the men's perspective and does seem adversarial and seems to represent a certain, neurotic fear of women. Again, kind of incel coded, if I were to read between the lines at all. Next, from I'm Just Pumped from Using the Mouse, we have Dilbert standing there saying, here's my new business card. I'm a romance interpreter. For a small fee, I'll accompany you on dates and translate between male and female language. It shows her going blah, blah, blah. Dilbert says she's telling a pointless story about work. By annoying you in this way, she hopes to form a closer bond. Weird that she associates annoyance with a bond. Maybe that's just kind of assuming what Dilbert is going to take it as, which is annoying. I don't know. Then the next panel, which continues this storyline, Dilbert turns to the woman. He's going blah, blah, blah. So I guess men and women both blah, blah, blah. He's telling you how to logically solve all of the emotional problems you seem to have. He reasons that if he can fix your problems, he won't have to hear about them anymore. He hopes that the wisdom and compassion he just faked was enough to arouse you. Now he will talk about himself. I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of that in how men and women relate to each other. This seems very much like a two-sided jab at men and women, but it does seem, I don't know, very comfortable with the idea of men and women, again, being adversarial and at cross purposes with each other, and as seeing dating as kind of crassly transactional. Part of this might just be observational humor. Part of it just feels a little uncomfortable to me, though. All right, here we have a comic where I think Dilbert is going to be like a date referee. The woman says, we always used to go to the whistle blows. He says, stop the action. That's a penalty for talking about an old boyfriend. He says the opposing date gets 1 minute to talk about a sports event. Dilbert says, then Mullen hits the jump shot. Whistle blows there. Penalty staring at the waitress for no legitimate reason. She says yes, I guess excited about that. He says the visiting team gets 1 minute to discuss feelings. And she says, I think of you in the friend category. And Dilbert says score. So not much here, except that, again, this just sees dating and relationships between men and women as very, very competitive, and men and women just being at cross purposes with each other. And again, if I were to be charitable with Scott Adams, this can just be pointing out what maybe naturally exists beneath the surface in a lot of dating, and it could just be observational humor. But the fact that this is the only way he seems to see men and women feels just a little uncomfortable to me. But you also have to take it in context the fact that most characters in these books are like this. There's not a lot of sincere human connection between people at all in these comics. There's a lot of competition, a lot of people looking to get one over on each other. So it could just be that men and women in dating are just one more representation of how he treats people in general through his humor, and that this is just that these comics are a little more rough around the edges, maybe kind of, Seinfeld-like, or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia-like, showing the worst of people or them at their most crass. So I don't know. There is that, to be fair, but something about this whole relationship between men and women in these stories it feels a little bit more than that, maybe. And again, I don't know if that's because I picked up that incel vibe and it colored how I read the rest of these comics with men and women in them. All right, then we have this one from the Casual Day book. A woman comes out and says, in a way, I'm glad the Albonians run this company now. After years of being the only female engineer, I'll enjoy watching the Albonians discriminate against you guys. The Albonian says, I didn't realize you had coffee wenches in this country too. Wally says, I hope you don't want children, Yorgi. The woman says, in this country, I think that might be Alice, but I can't tell. I don't know if she's been identified yet at this point. She says, in this country, we have a custom when men ask women to fetch coffee. Stand up, that's it. Now this will really surprise you. Wally says, oh God. And he says, I've never seen anybody get kicked into his hat before. Dilbert says, that's gotta hurt. So I guess we had somebody from another country being really sexist, and a woman kicked him as a matter of comeuppance or whatever. So I guess you go, feminist Scott Adams. You really showed that person from another country. It is interesting that a lot of, casual sexism seems to be accepted or implied in some of his comics. But here, when it's from another country, it's easy to point to that and make fun of that. So it almost seems a little more of a knock on other cultures and how backward they are than actually dealing with the underlying issues. And it's the same thing with that one where, the Albonians came in and they discriminated, whereas we have laws against that. So that almost feels like with racism and sexism both, they kind of punt the problem over somewhere else and pretend we don't have it here in America. So I know that's reading between the lines a bit, but Scott Adams did so many comics on women that I decided to split them up. The ones I did are the more benign ones. It gets a bit more intense, and I'm going to save those ones for a little bit later. He gets more direct on the issue of women for sure. And yeah, anyway, for our next topic, I guess let's get into religion and Scott Adams's take on religion. This is where, as an atheist, I might find myself more in agreement with him. So let's see what this looks like. I'm not just doing straight religion. I decided to group with this comics that deal with anything that he thinks is kind of kooky or superstitious, maybe. So that'll all just be thrown into one bin, partly for thematic reasons and partly because I have a lot of comics saved here that I have to cover and I want to get some of them out of the way at the same time. So here goes. This one's making fun of the idea of affirmations, I guess. And this is, again, in the book. I'm going through these in order. So this is Shave the Whales. Dilbert says, what's all the writing for? Dilbert says it's called affirmations. The theory is that if you write down your objective 15 times a day, the objective will be achieved no matter how unlikely. Dilbert says, but you've written down Dilbert will be eaten by a garden slug. He says it's all I could think of. Dilbert continues his reckless experiment with a powerful force of affirmations. Dilbert says, what if this actually works? Can you really cause me to be eaten by a garden slug just by writing it down over and over? He says, logically, or what am I saying? Logically, there's no way this could work. And Dilbert says, don't get too far from the salt. I guess this comic most directly, especially the first panel, is about the malice that Dilbert has for Dilbert and just how mean he generally is. I don't know, but it seems to be, a little bit of a lighthearted jab at it, but also there's this underlying fear that Dilbert as a skeptic has of anything that he's uncertain of. And we'll see that pop up again. All right, here's one that's just really directly about religion. Dilbert says, God spoke to me today. He appointed me ruler of all creatures on earth. Dilbert says, God did not speak to you. Dilbert says it was worth a shot. So I guess about the most straightforward, concise criticism of religion you might come up with, which is someone claims they speak for God and the other person says, no, you don't. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I guess it's direct and to the point. Here's one about meditation. Dilbert's up on a mountain with somebody who looks like, I don't know, some kind of mystic or something. The mystic says that the secrets of the universe will be revealed if you meditate. Dilbert says, can't you just tell me the secrets? To meditate, you must clear your mind of all thoughts. Dilbert says, if I have no thoughts, how will I know if I'm meditating? And how do I come out of it? I won't be able to think about stopping. And shouldn't stupid people be the best meditators of all? The person says, perhaps you are not ready. Dilbert says, perhaps you should spend more time with your thoughts. This is a pretty good one, I'll admit. Obviously, I think maybe it's a little obtuse about the idea of meditation and what it's supposed to do for you. But I love how it kind of plays with some of the logical questions behind, using it as a source of knowledge. Maybe it can bring you to a place of mindfulness, and clearing your thoughts doesn't necessarily mean you're not thinking about anything. But it's kind of funny. I like this one. Here, Dilbert says, I'm going to form a cult of personality to honor me. And again, sorry, some of these are bent and stuff. I just took photos of these. I tried to straighten them out the best I could. I'll take everybody's money and make them wear bathrobes with my picture on the back. Dilbert says, wouldn't it be cheaper to brand them and let them run naked? Dilbert says, as a rule, we're not talking about attractive people here. So isn't it silly to have a cult, I guess, and people in them aren't generally going to be attractive? I don't know. It shows somebody applying to join Dilbert's cult. They say, I hope you will accept me in the Dilbert cult. He says, you do have a strong resume. It looks like you've been fleeced by several spiritual leaders already. The person says, I think that demonstrates a complete absence of independent thought. And Dilbert says, can you chant? Okay. It's about the most general, basic, I guess, observations that, boy, aren't people in cults silly. It's okay. I won't agree to the extent that I think people who get drawn into cults are dumb or frivolous people. People end up in cults for, psychological reasons that are kind of complex and don't necessarily mean the person's stupid. So I guess I disagree on that level. But yeah, cults are irrational, and I agree with that. But I don't feel like there's anything super insightful about this. All right. This one has some dinosaurs, I guess, wanting to join Dilbert's cult. Dilbert's trying to deprogram them. He says, my theory is that the brain reflexively embraces the most ridiculous explanation of reality. So we'll think of something more ridiculous than following Dilbert's commands. I'm skipping through this a little bit, or, summing it up because it's kind of long. And a dinosaur says, like listening to you. They come up to Dilbert and says, we've come to resign from your cult. You can't push us around anymore. He says, resign, you're unworthy. I'll kick you out. They beg to be taken back. He says, I think this explains why dinosaurs don't rule the earth. Dilbert says, I think you've taken your cult idea too far. Who says it's a cult? You did. That has a bad connotation. A bunch of morons with nothing better to do with our lives. So just very generalized, again, criticism of cults. Who isn't going to agree with this, I suppose? Everyone can point and say, aren't cults dumb? But again, it's treating the problem as being that people who join cults are stupid. I disagree with that. I don't know. All right, here we have Dilbert falling. He says, oh, that looks like my body on the ground. Or maybe he's floating, I guess, since he sees his body on the ground. I must be dead. And that light, it's beautiful. It must be God. Shows Dilbert shining a light next a really big letdown. And so he's just sleeping and it's a flashlight. Okay. Dilbert dreams of death. He says, I'm coming toward the light. The light, it's so pure, so perfect. It could only be the light of God himself. Dilbert just says, no, just new batteries. And Dilbert says, God has a sense of humor? Of course, it explains everything. I guess it's not just being mistaken about the afterlife, but, you rationalize things when you hear information to the contrary. Dilbert says, I'm so embarrassed. I dreamed I died and saw the light of God. I trust you will just let this incident pass without comment. And Dilbert says, I command you to build an ark. And Dilbert gets frustrated. I guess a joke about somebody who, just won't stop making fun of somebody. Maybe this is trying to say that we all are susceptible to being mistaken, and you're kind of being a dork if you won't let it pass. I don't know. Anyway, in our next comic, Pumped from Using the Mouse, we only have one in this one. This has Dilbert at a computer typing, although raising children is difficult, be assured that you will get help from a power greater than yourself. Teach your children about the higher power and about the great book, which will give them direction. And that shows a parent next to his, looks like a baby. Weird that he's giving a book to a baby. It says, they're called TV listings. Without them, you're just flipping. Not really, I guess, a huge criticism of religion. It's just comparing the Bible, I guess. You think it's going to be the Bible and it's really a TV guide. Haha. Not exactly sure what's meant to be said there, whether it's comparing the Bible to the TV guide to point out how kind of frivolous it is to assign that much importance to a book, or more likely, the most straightforward reading of this is just that we in our country like TV too much, and we treat a TV guide as more important than the Bible. But one thing I find interesting about this one is just it feels like a relic of its time. You know, we don't use TV guides anymore at all. We barely watch TV. It's all streaming now. And so a lot of these are just kind of an interesting look into the past. Now, our final one from Casual Day Has Gone Too Far, where Dilbert is looking out at his boss and says, "You never answered my email." The boss says, "My secret is out. There's nobody to print my email for me. Bring me your message on hard copy." Dilbert says, "I was out of papyrus, so I chiseled my message on a little pyramid." The boss says, "Did he work alone or were UFOs involved?" So this one is mostly, just about how clueless Dilbert's boss is, like many of these are. He wants his computer communication printed, and so Dilbert goes one further and puts it on a stone tablet, taking the regressive technology even further back. And then the punchline, of course, has the boss thinking aliens were needed to build the pyramids. And it's kind of a side thing. It's within the context of the boss generally being clueless. So I don't think Scott Adams was really trying to take a directed jab at ancient aliens or really dig into it in this one. And that's what a lot of these are, is just humor as an aside, where you see these opinions just kind of seep through. So I think those opinions are there, but he does it in the context of humor, which is really, I think, the point when you're doing these. You're not trying to be really didactic. You just tell jokes and your opinions come out in that sometimes. But reading a lot of these ones that include criticisms of religion and maybe pseudoscience and stuff like that, which is something I'm going to, generally agree with, I was a little surprised at how just kind of bland and not funny it was. And maybe that's because I am more in tune with, or, have developed more ideas as someone who used to do dedicated atheist content creation with those kinds of observations and the humor surrounding them. And so maybe it's that, but it just feels like in general, Dilbert has not struck me as that funny. And is that just me now? Did I think they were funnier before? I used to read them a lot, but I remember finding it kind of unsatisfying to read Dilbert, and not just Dilbert, but comics in general. You'd get some laughs, but mostly you're just kind of trying to pass the time. And so I wonder if comics are really that funny as a medium. And there are a few reasons for that potentially. One is these comic artists had to produce work on pretty much a daily basis. And that is incredibly demanding. How are you going to come up with good jokes every single day? So I think, while they really aren't funny, I can understand why. It's a product of its time. Today we have the internet, and so we're so saturated with the funniest version of everything from all directions. They take off and go viral, and we're so overloaded with things that are funny, and it comes at us so frantically, and we get, I guess the internet is built in a way that gets us the best of everything from everybody. You're not counting on one person to come up with observations every day. You get everybody at their best in terms of humor. So I think that gets us on this almost hyperactive cycle of humor. And it shows me, I think, partly, this one's an observation about us now. We're in such a weird state of mind where we receive and consume and process all kinds of ideas, including humor, so fast that we have almost no attention span. And I wonder how much that colors my view of looking back at these comics. It's just less a jab at Scott Adams and a criticism of his work, and more just a look at what humor was like back then, how limited it was, just because we weren't in this hyper information environment back then. So here's one from Shave the Whales. Dilbert saying, "I read that dinosaurs evolved into the bird family." A dinosaur says, "That's exactly correct, Dilbert, but most people don't realize that there was a very difficult period when some dinosaurs started evolving into birds. Learning to fly was the hardest part, and it shows some dinosaurs trying to flap their arms and falling face first off a cliff. And living in trees was a real nuisance." Dilbert says, "Boy, that sounds tough." The dinosaur says, "The tragic part is that we did it just for the bonus miles." Now, I don't know whether this is intended by Scott Adams as a critique or any kind of commentary about evolution, or whether it's just kind of a casual joke, but it does contain some criticisms that, silly creationists have of evolution, which is like, well, how did they one day go from having arms to having wings? Wouldn't they have trouble flying in the meantime? Wouldn't the transitional species, which is a dumb concept in and of itself, have trouble surviving to get from this to this? So it's weird that Adams, even if he's not trying to comment again on evolution or say there's a problem with it, that he's presenting something that aligns with and maybe appeals to creationists. And I don't know if that's an attempt to appeal to them in some way. And he presents this in an uncritical or unironic way. And so, I don't know, to put an observation this obviously wrong out there, maybe it just carries a joke that, is just meant to be generally funny, but it feels a little off to me. And it feels like he is at least entertaining, or maybe, has some core misunderstanding of evolution that's just seeping through in his work. Anyway, and I'm still pumped from using the mouse. We have a couple that are a little more extended, I guess. We have Dilbert holding a long sheet of paper saying, "It took weeks, but I've calculated a new theory about the origin of the universe. According to my calculations, it didn't start with a big bang at all. It was more of a poof sound." I don't know how to say that. "You may be wondering about the practical applications of the little poof theory." And Dilbert just says, "I was wondering when you'll go away." So I have trouble knowing exactly what to take from this, other than maybe that Dilbert gets too caught up in some pet theory and Dilbert wants him to go away and doesn't want to listen to it. But it feels a little too comfortable with what, to me anyway, feel like creationist jabs at evolution. Next one, Dilbert saying, "Then Ratbert, the weight of the universe collapsed in on itself until all of existence could fit into a thimble." Ratbert says, "Why would there be a thimble in space?" Dilbert says, "Oh, there wouldn't." Ratbert says, "Boy, it didn't take long to spot the gaping logical flaw in that theory." So I don't know, it just feels like this one's just being silly. I guess maybe if anything, it's making fun of people who misunderstand evolution. And this isn't exactly evolution, this is cosmology. But I guess the reason I group these together is these are all things that creationists see as one thing and they criticize in the same way. Next, we have Ratbert saying, "I think I'm evolving into a flying rat. I've noticed that my arms are flatter than my parents' arms. In a million years, this natural advantage will become wings." Dilbert says, "There goes the happiest rat I know." He says, "Too soon." So this feels a little like the dinosaur joke where, you flap your arms and hope to become a bird. And I'm not sure what the joke is supposed to be here other than Ratbert being silly. But again, it seems to feed into creationist canards about evolution, or at least reflect them. So continuing the story, this strip has Dilbert saying, "Evolution takes millions of years, Ratbert. You'll be long gone before rats develop flying skills." Ratbert says, "That's what they said to the Wright brothers." Dilbert says, "But they built an airplane." Ratbert says, "Don't you think they tried this first?" Dilbert says, "It will be impossible to fly by flapping your arms. Is he right, Bob?" Bob says, "That just depends on how hard you flap." And Ratbert says, "It must be embarrassing to you." So I guess same thing as always with these. It's hard to know where he's going with this. It seems mostly like just frivolous little jokes, but it feels like it appeals maybe a little too much to creationists. And I don't know if he's trying to smooth things over with them, especially considering some of his observations about religion. I don't know whether it's just frivolous jokes or what. It's kind of weird that most of his observations about evolution just seem to reflect something that comes out of creationism or reflects their thinking. And maybe it's just his general desire to be contrarian, which he is with a lot of things. And a part of this could be as simple as the fact that he just has to, there's a big demand for him to create output. Like you're just always trying to make a comic a day, stuff crosses your mind and you just do things. It's just that the pattern's interesting. That's all. So next, I thought we might just take a look at Scott Adams's take on capitalism and communism. You might guess he has some things, at least peripherally, to say about capitalism, since most of his comics are about the workplace. So let's look at those. I'm going to start with a couple that touch on communism, just because I found them a little interesting. All right, here, Dilbert plays a reckless prank with Dilbert's prototype hotline to the Kremlin. Hey, Gorby, did you hear this quote? Communism is the most painful path between capitalism and capitalism. Fire one, haha, what a kidder you are. So I guess the punchline on this one is that Dilbert was a little clueless and started a nuclear war. But it seemed like this strip was mostly a vehicle for delivering the line, communism is the shortest path between capitalism and capitalism. Obviously meaning that communism is a failure and that you start capitalist, you become communist, and you cycle back to it. Okay. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily seem like a really strong opinion, but it seems like kind of a clear one. And the fact that he devoted this comic to delivering it seems, a little bit telling. But it also just seems like such a basic right-wing bro thing to say about the topic. I don't know. It seems indicative of just a genre of pithy statements that dismiss communism. Let's look at another one. So Dilbert says, to do our part for East-West relations, I've decided to host a dog from the Soviet exchange program. Dilbert says, what? Dilbert says, Dilbert, I'd like you to meet Nikita Dorgachev. So it's Gorbachev, but a dog. And I guess that was so funny that he, set it up and then paid it off. But Dilbert is in full-on tank, so I guess it's just showing how combative he is, and he says charmed. All right. They talk with each other. Dilbert says he seems harmless. Dorgachev says, greetings, Comrade Dilbert. I've come to learn capitalist system from dog's perspective. And then he says, and your God is this Donald Trump. Dilbert says, I don't think it's official yet. Well, isn't that prescient, huh? Interesting, considering Scott Adams would eventually turn MAGA, that this seems like at least a playful riff on capitalism and of the worship of Donald Trump. I don't know exactly what he meant by this, if this was meant to say that, Trump is this kind of figurehead of capitalism that might be taken a little lightly. Anything I say like that's probably going to read a lot into it, but it feels like a playful jab at that whole thing. And the fact that it's as predictive of the future as it is just kind of sad. Then they're talking, and Dilbert says, you see, Dorgy, under our capitalist system, anybody can become rich. Dorgy says, how? And by the way, Gorbachev's nickname, I think, was Gorby, so that's what they're doing here. Dilbert says, inheritance and crime are the most popular methods. Which is the preferred method? It's best to have your parents do the crime and let you inherit it. So this feels like a pretty direct and incisive jab on capitalism, right? You have to either commit a crime or have rich parents to get rich. Pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and doing it the right way is kind of a fiction. And it almost seems like he's hinting that, there's a lot of ugly stuff behind whatever wealth you have if you were born into it in this country. Next, we have Dilbert saying, Dorgy, why are you dressed like a maid? Dilbert is teaching me capitalism. Today, I'm a lowly maid, but with hard work, I will be promoted to a job as major industrialist, right? Dorgy says, apparently there's a flaw in the system. Dilbert says, yeah, but we blame it on the Japanese. So yeah, in this comic, not only do we have a criticism of the idea of working your way up from the bottom, and, showing that that's something that you can't really do, but it's something that the rich people hold over your head and try to get you to do. And then when you point out that it doesn't work that way, in this case, you blame the Japanese. Back when this was written, the Japanese were, at least more recently, our economic competitors. But there's just something about the rich holding the working class down and then blaming an outside group that feels kind of relevant to our time. And no, this doesn't feel like something Scott Adams would probably say today, that the rich are holding us down and blaming an outside group, for example, immigrants. I feel like him being a fan of Trump, he'd probably espouse that now. So maybe his thinking has evolved, not necessarily for the better. Anyway, the next few are more specifically about capitalism and just about business. So here we have this comic. I don't want to read this whole thing, but basically someone grabs Dilbert and takes him to the boss. And this is before the boss is the pointy-haired guy. They said a generic boss here. The boss is saying, I want competent leadership while I'm gone. Dilbert thinks it's going to be him. And the boss says, no, it's going to be a sock monkey. So we don't value our employees. So in this one, we have Dilbert saying, did you hear that the tiny East European country of Albania has abandoned communism? Dilbert says, whoa, big changes ahead. This says Albonia Monday, mud farm. Albonia Tuesday, my tree, my mud farm, my feet, my pig. So I guess this could have fallen under the communism one, since it's kind of talking about communism, but mostly criticizing capitalism. So I guess when you turn to capitalism, nothing changes except that you say stuff's yours. Okay. So now Dilbert is talking to the Albanians. They're standing in the mud because Albonia is just made out of mud, and that's their only product. That's kind of the lore behind this. Dilbert says, the first thing you Albanians must understand about capitalism is the incentive system. If you're willing to work 12 hours a day, eventually the guy who owns your factory will get rich. The Albonians say, am I missing something here? Dilbert says, then you guys get to watch great TV shows based on the millionaire's life. So he's just straight out coming out and saying that you're just working to improve the lives of the rich people and they're feeding off you and throwing you little crumbs in terms of entertainment that lets you live vicariously through them, I guess. So he seems pretty anti-capitalist in a lot of these. In Pumped from Using the Mouse, we have one that says, welcome to sales training. As you know, our company makes overpriced, inferior products. We try to compensate by setting high sales quotas. We don't ask you to act illegally, but it's pretty much the only way to reach our quota. Anyway, that's it for training. Any questions? So I guess just general lack of ethics on the part of a business. And this is where the more we get into this, Dilbert becomes more office-based as it goes on. And it becomes hard to distinguish jabs at capitalism as an institution from just general observational humor about living in an office and how bad your boss is and how the quirks and even downsides of business. I don't know. To me, there's something that feels different about that from the perspective of a worker versus an overall social criticism. Or at the very least, it's hard to completely untangle them from each other and tell which is which. But I think maybe one thing here that this might indicate is a lack of awareness of, or maybe lack of concern for the broader issue and more of a concern for the issue when it touches you personally. So instead of being socially aware and concerned for others, it's more just like griping over things that bother you from your day at work. And this seems to align with, Adams being MAGA, not really being concerned with or probably, wanting to see universal health care, for example, but then being happy when Trump said he'd make sure he got his health needs taken care of. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading between the lines here, but I feel like there might be a thread there. All right, this one, and I'm going to start blowing through these because reading these all is going to take a while. The boss just says, I've had enough of these wimpy management techniques like empowerment and quality, and he just starts shocking people. So boss is just punishing you. And it is easy to kick the can down to the boss and say, boy, aren't bosses bad? Bosses are meant to be the lightning rods for all your ire, so you don't think about the people at the top are really causing all your problems. But I'm reading a lot into things that are just about being annoyed at work. Here, Dogbert's saying, does it bother you that I won $50 million in my lawsuit, whereas you still toil and remain middle class? Does it bother you that I could buy and sell you how many times? A woman comes in and says 834 times. And he says, hey, it's gone up since lunch. So again, the rich class being predatory and basically owning you. And also that things just rise so quickly with the market, I guess, and they see people in terms of economic value. But also there's a part of this where the lawsuit plays into it, and that seems more like a critique of, excessive lawsuits. I don't know. Here we have the boss carrying a temporary worker like he's a bag of potatoes. He says, I love hiring them. No employee benefits, no union. Just toss them in the dumpster when you're done with them. Dilbert says the dumpster seems a bit inappropriate, and the boss says they're way too big to flush. So yeah, this seems like more of a direct criticism of the system, right? Not only abusing temps, but using temps or contractors. They found all kinds of ways to get away from having to pay people benefits and a living wage. So this seems like a direct comment on that. This one is just basically Dogbert as a consultant saying that the company's problems are that of the employee, not management, and saying that you could really work to make this company a success. And I think that's Wally. He just says, I'd get a plaque. So again, you're just working for the rich and you just get little tiny tokens in response. All right. And then a casual day has gone too far. We only have 3 in this one. And we had literally none about, I think, evolution in our last one. And I noticed that casual day has gone too far. It shifted a lot more toward, like I said, business-based, just office life humor. And there was a lot less of anything that could be interpreted as social commentary in that one. So the number of comics I picked for that one was pretty slim. Anyway, here's the comic. Dogbert as a consultant says, your best bet is to relocate the company to Russia. You can hire engineers for 2 cents a year. Is it difficult to weed out the dumb ones? No, and that leads me into the good news about their occupational safety laws. Boss says it's like heaven. We know what that's about. Basically, wanting to work your way around labor laws to abuse people and being willing to go overseas or use overseas labor to do that. Here's Catbert. He was a character that entered the story as an HR director. He's been asked to reduce the cost of employee benefits. The company will no longer pay for eyeglasses, but we will support a new vision correction procedure. Dilbert says radial keratotomy. I don't know what that is. And Catbert says squinting. So basically, they're going to take away your benefits. And here, a pretty pointed criticism, I would say. Boss says, we're poised for success. We expect huge earnings and increased market share. Next on the agenda, there will be no raises because it will be a difficult year. And then he says, Carol, I thought I told you to put the United Way update between those two agenda items. And she says, oopsie. And she's saying it with kind of a casual face as if she did it on purpose. And I've seen places do this. I think it's pretty standard. They tell you, that things are going well. I guess we're paying dividends to shareholders, but also we have to tighten our belt loops for whatever reason. So again, businesses or the rich feeding off the working class. So those were all the ones I could see that were about capitalism. I really had to trim these ones down. I could have read a lot of comics as being about capitalism in one way or the other, just because so many were about the quirks and hypocrisies and corruption in business. But these were the ones that I think came closest to actually being some kind of observation on the topic, or closest to a direct, broad criticism of the systems themselves and not just a boss being annoying. So what does this say? Again, as with everything, Scott Adams seems to be a mixed bag. There's some typical criticisms of communism, but I think he seems to hit more heavily on capitalism. And there does seem to be some thoughts that extend beyond just his annoyance as a worker and his own personal concerns, at least some peripheral awareness of what's wrong with capitalism. I don't know if he would have expressed himself this way later in life, or if he just has a blind side toward, like I said, the broader issue and is more concerned about himself. I don't really know. So now is a perfectly good time, I think, to get into our next series of strips about women. This is just one that's a little more sometimes pointed and offensive, and just generally a little more specific. So let's look at a few of them. Here we have a storyline that is going to get pretty bad. Doorbell rings. Dogbert says, must be your blind date. I'll let her in. Dilbert says, how's she look? Dogbert says, well, you could say she's a full-bodied individual. Dilbert says, you mean she's a little overweight? Dogbert says, I mean, Sherpas have established a base camp on her ankles. So this is Dilbert on a date again, except this one's just going to be full on making fun of a woman's weight. Dilbert says, you're saying my blind date is a tad on the large side. Dogbert says, no. He says, I'm saying her family portrait was taken by Voyager 2. Dilbert says, funny. I better not keep her waiting at the door. Do not anger Jabba the date. So, this just shows that, opinions aside, Scott Adams was willing and ready to be just extremely offensive. I don't know. This again might be a product of its time, but there's a certain edginess here that probably, regardless of when you were alive, speaks to your character. This continues as if we haven't seen enough. Dilbert greets his blind date. This is the biggest woman I've ever seen. Hi. He says, I have only one chance of financially surviving dinner, because she's probably going to eat a lot. He says, say, why don't we go to the all-you-can-eat house of starch and pasta? Can't ban for life. He says, I will never go on another blind date. So Jabba, Janet, have you dated many other men? So call her Jabba multiple times, talk about how much she eats. This is really classy stuff. She says, yes, but they all disappeared without a trace. Incidentally, you look delicious. So she literally eats her dates because she's so fat. It's just mean and also juvenile. I don't like this. Dilbert says, you mean all of your ex-boyfriends disappeared without a trace? She says, yeah, it's the strangest thing. He says, good Lord, she must have eaten them. And then he's back at home with Dogbert saying, so while she was sucking the cheesecake off the dessert cart, I dove out the window. So I don't know how much this represents Scott Adams' opinion about women or just his general ability to be vile, but it's not super cool. And I think little things like this give us a little inkling into maybe the kind of person he is and his ability to be offensive. I don't know. If somebody eventually became MAGA and, turned extremely racist and are willing to just make Jabba dates about a woman and talk about how because she's fat, she ate all her dates in just this really mean-spirited way, I feel like there's something beneath the surface there that's just waiting to come out when you feel like you have the social permission to be a horrible racist, or maybe, I don't know, maybe just get cantankerous at that age. Either way, I think it's fair to notice a connection here. So sorry to cut in here after the fact, but In the middle of editing this video, I just experienced a fresh wave of disgust at this storyline and felt like I didn't really say enough about it when recording. Because this is one of those things that just really makes sure that a certain population of people is put in their place. And I don't know, it's not just the insults, which are plentiful and horrific in this, storyline, but it's the conclusion, which is Dilbert all disheveled and basically running for his survival to get away from this woman and never see her again. And I know that within the text of this story, the reason for that is that I guess she literally eats her dates. But we know that doesn't happen, and that isn't reflective of anything that actually occurs in society. And so then we have to ask ourselves, since I think this is meant to, reflect something, what is it trying to tell us? And sometimes you can read between the lines and try to find meaning in something that's just a joke, but I think this one is clearly telling us something real about dating and about how men see women, or at the very least, a feeling that the author and I would suppose his audience has about women. And that is that if you're fat, you're to be discarded and essentially ostracized, that's at least a normal reaction to you. Not necessarily saying that people have an obligation to do that or that it is the thing you should do, but that it's a natural thing to do, and just escaping in whatever way you can and letting that person be alone is just the natural course. And I don't know, I guess I'm a little at a loss for words here, but I don't care for that, because any woman reading this is going to feel, I think, something about that. If you're overweight, clearly this is communicating something to you, and I'm sorry that does. Even if you're not, to the extent this woman is, or even at all, even if you just perceive yourself as overweight or underweight or just unattractive in some way, I feel like things like this, and in this case, very aggressively, tell you that you're a commodity to either be enjoyed or used up and discarded, and you could be thrown away at a moment's notice. And with all the neurosis that women, especially probably young women, feel about themselves, if you experienced anything like that watching this, I'm not trying to white knight or anything like that, but I think it's worth just acknowledging that instead of just what I was originally doing, I think, which is kind of academically discussing what this meant about Adams's mindset. Because in some cases like these, I don't know, what he says is interesting in exploring what that means about him. But in some cases, you have to step in and point out that there are people on the receiving end of this, and sometimes that's more important. Anyway, back to the video. So we're on another storyline now. Dogbert, the ambush reporter, looks for another victim. So there was this whole string of ambush interviews that Dogbert did. This is just another one of those. So it was making fun of ambush interviews in general and how the media, tries to gotcha people. He says, in this case, is it true you have often fantasized about marrying a rich guy and ditching your career? She says, yes. And I secretly learned to cook. He says, is that yarn sticking out of your briefcase? So I see a few ways to look at this, maybe. One, of course, is women as gold diggers. They're just trying to get a man for the money. Also, maybe an implicit critique of feminism that, if women have any kind of side of themselves that wants to be domestic, they need to hide it. Like, you don't want to show that you have yarn because you want to learn how to cook. I don't know. A lot of possibilities, I guess, in this one. It's hard to know exactly which message he means to present. And then also, this feels like a precursor to maybe the whole trad wife thing. This woman wants to turn away from her career and just live at home and be supported. But I guess that's where a lot of things that get labels like the whole trad wife movement and stuff, they're just continuations of ongoing issues. And that's part of what I find interesting in this. All right, so here we have one where Dilbert's on a date. She says, thanks for asking me to dinner, Dilbert. He says, it's my pleasure. And he's in the middle of trying to say it's my pleasure, I guess. And she says, I love eating out. What kind of tablecloth is this? I saw a movie last month. He says, uh-oh, she's a serial yacker. Yak, 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 blah, blah, yak, yak. She changes topics without even pausing to breathe. It's too hard to listen. I'm slipping into a coma. Yak, yak, yak. What's the problem? Run, save yourself. She keeps yakking. The waiter identifies her as a serial yacker, and everyone's trying to play dead, I guess. So I don't know why I put this one off. I don't know if it seems that directly critical of women. This is the kind of thing that Adams would make a joke about with people in general. Somebody just talks a lot. But a lot of this stuff feels like it focuses on women a lot. So I don't know. I just feel like there's some kind of attitude toward women reflected in this. So yeah, I know, stepping in again. Even though this strip isn't as obviously derogatory toward women in a targeted way, and that, like I said in my original recording, this could be seen as similar to jokes that Scott Adams makes about anybody who has annoying habits. So maybe this is just another example of that happens to be about a woman that Dilbert's on a date with. I do see the connection that you might have seen too, which is that in either encounter with a woman, when something problematic or annoying or in any way undesirable happens, the reaction is for Dilbert to try to escape as if for his life, and other people try to escape too. So there is that undertone that is hard to miss, or that thread. And the idea or the vibe I get for this definitely seems to be that women are either pleasant to you or not. And if they're not pleasant, boy, you just need to get out of there. And I'm not so sure I like that. Again, maybe not trying to communicate any really clear opinion. But if not, there is an underlying mentality, I feel like, about women that is slipping out in not a super subtle way. Back to the video again, and don't make me turn that camera on again, old recording version of me. All right, here at the office, a woman says, "My defantilator can eliminate the unproductive and naughty thoughts of your male employees. We succeeded in getting men to stop acting like men, but it wasn't enough. Men must stop thinking like men too." She points at him and says, "Hey, cut it out." He says, a little makeup and a new hairdo. A couple things here. Number one, this feels like, it's not really indicating that men should take responsibility for themselves, that they're just who they are, and you need to invent a machine to eliminate that part of them. That's a little speculative, I guess, but there does feel like there's a boys will be boys vibe to this. But even more, there's kind of this pre-cancel culture thought control mentality behind this comic, which is, number one, it identifies that they're not doing anything wrong. They're just being men. So I guess that literally is boys will be boys. She's not saying they need to stop acting bad or poorly. They need to stop acting like men. And then also you need to stop thinking like men. So we're trying to get in there and dig out your thoughts. She says, "There's another unproductive man daydreaming about attractive women. A short burst from my defantilator should set him straight." She fires it off. He says, "Hey, I think I'm starting to like figure skating." So I guess, and maybe I'm reading into this, it seems like they're throwing a little mild homophobia in there while they're at it. Men will be men, and if they're manly men, they're just gonna be themselves. But when you pull that out of them and try to wreck them, then they'll like figure skating, which I think is coded as kind of a gay thing for a guy. I feel like that's what they're getting at with this. So here's one where they're all in the boardroom. You all know our president, Mr. Goodenrich. He's here to answer any questions you have. A woman, I think it's Alice, says, "Why aren't there any women or minorities in senior management positions?" The CEO says, "We think women are for making babies. As for minorities, we fear them." Wally says, "How can you justify your $10 million salary when profits are down?" He says, "Haha, the board of directors are friends of mine and it's not their money they're spending." Dilbert says, "Why does the company keep talking about employee training while at the same time slashing the training budget?" The boss says, "We think you're too dumb to train. We'll hire people from the outside if we need talent." Wally says, "I must say your honesty is kind of refreshing." And he says, "And you're all fired for asking questions." So this, I guess, is criticizing sexism in the workplace. I guess he notices that, the glass ceiling is bad and holding women down is bad, not letting up in management positions. That's what this feels like anyway. So again, he's just this kind of mixed bag of different opinions, or at least a mixed bag of opinions comes through in his writing. Again, maybe it's just humor. Maybe he's critical of everything. He's, even-handed offender, equal opportunity offender, whatever. Okay, so our final one from Casual Day has gone too far. This one gets a little direct on the issue of women and feminism. Dogbert says, "I feel like tweaking some brittle people. Do you know any brittle people?" I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think it's essentially kind of maybe this version of snowflake, somebody who, if you mess with them, they fall apart. Dilbert says, "Try Tina the tech writer. She believes that all forms of expression are an insult to her gender and her profession." So women are just too sensitive nowadays, huh? They're easily offended. Dogbert says, "The statue of Venus de Milo has no arms." She says, "Oh, I get it. You're saying that women can't lift heavy objects." So don't those women take offense to everything. This one hits a little different because it feels like it's meant to be an actual commentary on feminism and how they overreact. But this doesn't seem to ring true to me. And it just seems like, seems like you're being shitty and just making up things that they get offended by so you can dismiss them as always offended. Next one. And the reason it says Dilbert tweaks Tina the brittle tech writer is, these were released day by day in the newspaper. And so you kind of had to bring people up to date. He says, what do you think of the movie Thelma and Louise? She says, I know what you're trying to say. You think all women are bad drivers. That's really the point of the movie, isn't it? And then the top says, if you're not offended yet, tune in tomorrow. He says, The Three Stooges. Why are all the documentaries about men? So don't those feminists just get offended by everything? All right. And this continues. We keep we keep doing this storyline, this really direct observation that, boy, those feminists, they get offended by everything. This deserves a few panels. Dilbert says, is technical writing the same as word processing? She yells, no. I am a highly skilled communications professional. I can take jumbles of inert thoughts and bring them to life. As somebody who writes a lot of training documentation at my work, I can appreciate this. Taking a process and turning it into real clear instructions, or taking other people's writings and doing that, that's pretty hard. So, I'm on her side on this one. I understand where she's coming from. But again, this is all just supposed to show that women, they're just too touchy, aren't they? Boss says, my secretary is running the staff meeting. I need you to retype this org chart. Dilbert says the doctor is in. So I guess really in this case, she just is basically a secretary who types, and she has an overblown sense of self-importance and gets offended when you question that. All right. So this one gets interesting because this indicates to me that this maybe became a thing, and this is direct communication from Scott Adams to his audience. Dilbert says, this week we introduced Tina the brittle tech writer to the strip. Tina is dysfunctional like everybody here except me, which is an interesting observation because, like I'd mentioned before, a lot of the people in these comics are just kind of bad people, or it shows the worst, most transactional sides of their relationships. So how much of this is really about women and how much of this is just people in general? I think that might be what Dilbert is trying to say, or Scott Adams is trying to say through Dilbert. But I do feel like that excuse doesn't cover everything, and I feel like there is some stuff targeted directly at women here. Dilbert says, send your opinions by email to scottadams@aol.com. It's the only way we can learn. She says, And this is kind of a product of its times, not only using America Online. I think he had some kind of contract with them where he would use their services and also they would present some of his material. But it's kind of funny to see an email option presented for how to get a hold of somebody about something like this. Maybe it still is, but it seems like social media is more of a typical way to contact people. And then in the end, it says, pick one. A, women should only be portrayed as lawyers and starship captains. B, I don't have email. C, Tina should be treated with the same dignity as Dilbert and Wally. D, take an art class. So I think this is essentially a continuation of what Dilbert said, just presented as a series of options to the audience. Unless all of our female characters are Mary Sue's, then you're going to get offended. And then I think option C is, yeah, we're going to either do that or treat her like the other characters, which again, there's some truth to that. But I feel like there's just something dysfunctional coming through in how he talks about women in these comics. All right. So at this point, I think I'm going to change things up. I'm not going to lie. I'm not feeling my best today. My throat's a little bit sore and I'm tired and I have a giant headache. I can just really feel it behind my eyes. And so I hope I'm giving you something worth listening today. I feel like I might just be talking my way through individual comments and giving my thoughts on them and not tying everything together into a single thread the way I hope to. But I don't know, we'll see. But not feeling well and also just seeing how long it takes to get through all these different topics. What I'm going to do now, I've kind of sifted a lot of them through my list and I have a lot of oddball things left. And so I think maybe I'm just going to go through the rest of the strips I have left and comment on them one by one and give my thoughts after that. So here we go. Oh, and I'll probably do it a little more rapid fire, but we'll see if that happens, knowing me. So in this one, Dilbert hits a fly. Dilbert asks why it's okay to kill flies, but not dolphins. He's asked if the poor fly is less deserving of our respect and protection. Dilbert says, hold still, there's a dolphin on your forehead. And he says, I've added the ASPCA, probably an animal rights organization, to our speed dialer. So I guess pointing out the inconsistency in people's animal rights perspective, if you're willing to kill a fly, I don't know. I guess I can get that, but dolphins and more intelligent animals are different from flies. So anyway, I've decided it's time to stop talking about world hunger and start doing something. Let others debate policy. My time to act is now. You're going to buy a Smarmy bumper sticker, aren't you? He says darn straight. This is something that we see in these a lot, which is just futile attempts at being a good person, just empty gestures, trying to make you feel like you're an activist or something. Here, Dilbert and Dogbert are talking. Dilbert says, oh, sure, Dan Quayle may be vice president of the United States, but he still puts his pants on one leg at a time. It shows him sticking both of his arms through a pair of pants, and his wife saying, oh, Lord, not this again. So this may be a dated joke. Vice President Dan Quayle had a reputation of being stupid. I think he misspelled the word potato or something like that, and that just latched onto him. And so that's what this is. I don't know. Is this really political? Hard to say. It just feels like a silly gag making fun of somebody who has a reputation of being dumb. And setup and payoff is just kind of clumsy. This one I found interesting. Welcome to another meeting of the Skeptic Society. Tonight we will use scientific methods to debunk Edna Griffin's claim that she can turn an audience into a flock of chickens. We'll need some volunteers. Dilbert says, motion to adjourn. Someone else says, well, look at the time. So I guess while Dilbert seems like a generally skeptical-minded comic strip when it comes to like religion and superstitions and stuff like that, I guess this one's trying to say that when the chips are down and you have to risk something actually happening to you, you're going to lose your nerve and maybe wonder if something is there behind the supernatural, which is an interesting take towards skeptics. Again, maybe this is just him being an equal opportunity offender and pointing out the quirks in everybody. But I think it's funny that we have this in his history and he eventually did the, I'll just sign up for Christianity just in case thing later in life. Oh, this one I enjoyed. Dilbert says, many great men kept diaries. Dogbert says, not to mention the entire Kirk Cameron fan club. And here, Dilbert saying Monday, woke up, went to work, came home, ate TV, and went to bed. He says that was both therapeutic and satisfying. And Dogbert says, sometimes it's good to bury your soul like that. So I guess Dilbert just has a mundane life. But then at the end, Dilbert says, who the heck is Kirk Cameron? And it says, Tuesday, see Monday. So I guess he lives a life where all he does is goes to work and watches TV. But I just enjoyed the fact that this comic insinuated that people don't know who Kirk Cameron is, and that's always a nice thing to hear. Here's Dogbert as a substitute teacher. Jennifer, put that flamethrower away right this minute. Eugene, release those hostages or I shall be forced to fling this chalk eraser at your head. Is that a Stinger missile launcher? Well, I hope you brought enough for everybody, and they said I did. This feels like it's maybe ahead of its time in terms of our classrooms being full of weapons. I don't know if this is supposed to be a gun control commentary. It just seems like it's more targeted at children being badly behaved. Right here, Dilbert says, now that you've united the electronic mail users of the world, what are you going to do? Dogbert says, I'll pull them about their needs, then use their collective political and economic power to get them whatever the majority wants. Dilbert says, couldn't you easily rig the vote to support your own selfish ambitions? Dogbert says, I love the democratic system. So there are a lot of comics throughout here that have Dogbert becoming a little bit of an authoritarian, kind of a populist authoritarian. I'm not going to turn this into its own category and go through them one by one. I'm just going to let them play out as we go through the rest of these comics. But this is interesting because I think it shows how a demagogue can manipulate democracy. So that's good. But on the other hand, this almost smells a little bit like a democracy doesn't work thing. In this one, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Dilbert just decides that Kleenex boxes are too feminine and that's not fair to men. So he buys sandpaper to make a statement. This just feels like, dude wipes or Jeremy's razors or something like that. It's just interesting how many of these current issues or products or whatever, you can see the seeds of those going back, or just, I guess, how universal they are. Here we have a waiter saying, I've taken the liberty of calculating a 20% tip. It's written on the back next to a picture of a smiling diner. A 15% tip is shown by the picture of a guilty-looking diner. Below that is a picture of a diner and his dog with salad forks in their backs. So criticism of tipping, I guess. I don't know. Tipping has become a hot topic, I guess, because it's everywhere, not just when you're dining. When you just walk up to a counter and get something real quick, they ask if you want a tip. I think the bigger issue is maybe that you should pay people who work in food service enough to where they don't need tips, like a lot of other countries do. Don't make them beg and perform to get paid properly. But this seems to be showing more attitude toward a snooty waiter who just wants your money. So in this one, we have a scientist with a lab rat. He offers him a beer and the rat drinks it. And I guess this is about peer pressure. He says, of course, there's more to science than this hurting animals, but frankly, it's the best part. So this feels like animal rights, anti-animal testing thing, right? Again, Scott Adams seems a little bit like an enigma in terms of his different stances on different things. So before we get on to the next ones, which are from Still Pumped from Using the Mouse, I want to take a look at this introduction here. He writes these extended introductions that seem a little maybe self-indulgent and show that he's not a super great writer, in my opinion, of extended prose. He can put comics together, and those are kind of clever. But when he tries to write something out, it sounds a little amateur. I don't know. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that. What I want to point out is a paragraph where he says, in any event, quitting just isn't my style. I'm more likely to hire illegal immigrants to do the writing and drawing for me. They might not bring the same wit and artistic integrity to the strip that I do, and it might not be in English. But let's face it, my work isn't a home run every single day either. It'll probably take a decade for anybody to notice, and by then I'll be burned out too. So I don't know that this is like the most offensive thing that I've heard about illegal immigrants in that I live right now in this current stage of history. But I don't really care for him saying that he could just grab them to do his strip. His comment that they wouldn't have the same wit and integrity that he does might just be that, you take the average person to sub in for you and it wouldn't be the same thing. But that, along with saying they wouldn't do it in English, feels like kind of, I don't know, a bigoted jab at them. And so I didn't care for that. And it feels like there's a through line from this to, where he's at now as a MAGA person who's racist. Anyway, let's move on. Here we have Dilbert getting sucked into a computer. Dogbert says, let's hope you don't need pants in cyberspace. So I guess his pants stayed behind. Kind of like Tron, except not with a laser. Dilbert says, wow, it's like a Calvin and Hobbes fantasy, but without the artistic look to it. It's beautiful. I'm interacting with the minds of brilliant people from around the globe. I can see all their ideas and knowledge fit together. It's exhilarating. How can I ever describe this as somebody who hasn't been here? And then he says, and I didn't even need pants, so you're some kind of nerd, right? Not much to this in terms of opinion or anything like that. I just thought it was interesting as a look back in history that he still saw the internet as a place where, all the best ideas in the world would come together and mesh and, just become a boon for science and for the good of humanity instead of the dumpster fire that it currently is and that helped, create MAGA and him and that he used to express his brazen racism. Here the boss says, sometimes I wonder how my life would be different if all whales were extinct. It's not like they do anything for us. You never hear of seeing eye whales. They can't fetch the paper or drag you out of a burning building. Don't you think the world has too many fat, worthless mammals? Dilbert says, I was just thinking that, sir. This is another just clueless boss thing, but it's interesting that the boss being clueless is tied to, not liking any animal that doesn't do anything directly to him. And it seems like on top of everything else, the boss is kind of anti-environmentalist, and Adam seems critical of that. So good for you, Scott Adams. Here we have Dogbert watching TV. It says the budget for education was cut $10 million. Dogbert says, is that a big percentage or thinks, does it make any difference? Congress considered a music safety law after studies showed a 10% increase in piano-related deaths. How does that relate to other risks? Lawmakers debated a bill to lower capital gains rates. What do most economists think? Would it stimulate the economy much? Should I care? A new poll shows that many voters have strong opinions on these issues despite the fact that we provide no useful contextual data. I'm going to stop watching scary shows right before bedtime. This one isn't necessarily a lot in and of itself, but it's a thread that runs throughout a lot of these, which is criticism of the media as stirring up fear and generally, I guess, being inaccurate, which there's something to that. But if we're looking for seeds of MAGA in this, I think this distrust of the media, fits well with eventually liking Trump. All right, so here's the beginning of a storyline where Dogbert's going to conquer the Earth. Bob, I need your help in my quest to conquer the Earth. Bob, the dinosaur, says, what do I do? Dogbert says, I'll use my powers of hypnosis to control everybody who sees me on television. You must whack everybody else with your mighty tail. Did I ever mention that I have sensitive skin? Start with accountants, they're soft and you can build calluses. Then he says, this is Dogbert. You are all under my hypnotic powers. I am the supreme ruler of Earth. You must all carry Dogbert posters and chant Dogbert is my king. That is all for now. If I think of anything else important, I'll let you know. And Ratbert has a sign saying Dogbert is my king. Dilbert says, may I have a word with you? He basically explains what he did, hijacked a satellite and hypnotized everybody. And I guess he gets punished for chewing out Dogbert by having to wear a bra now. That's kind of weird. Wally says, you have to admit, since Dogbert conquered the Earth, we've had no wars and the economy improved. Dilbert says it could be a coincidence. All he's ordered so far is that we carry his pictures and wear bras. Wally says, I think you're afraid of change. Dilbert says, don't think you're a decup. Okay. And then in the end, Dogbert retires. So I don't know, this whole thread felt like kind of an authoritarian thing in Trump style. he takes over. Everyone's like, well, at least there's no war in the economy approved, which are two things Trump claims to be for. That's not really panning out now, though. And everyone carries around his paraphernalia. This is all pretty, I think, generic stuff, I guess, for any ruler. So maybe it's not that interesting a connection, but I don't know. Here in this one, Dilbert says, and people who don't bother to vote have no right to complain. Dilbert says, why not? Dilbert says, why not? It's obvious. No vote means no right to complain. You can't get much more logical than that. Besides, that's how I was raised. You were raised by bumper stickers. So this one's kind of strange. Like, I guess I can't say that if you don't vote, you shouldn't be allowed to complain. You know, everybody should, I guess, be able to complain about the outcomes of things or have their opinions. And sometimes voting can get difficult for some people. But it's weird how this strip takes something that does kind of make sense, and partway through it, Dilbert just says, well, my parents told me so. Scott Adams just seems like a weirdly opinionated person with just a lot of weird random opinions in all directions. I think I've said before, there's a sincerity in that I can kind of appreciate, even if he is a shithead sometimes. Often. This one just has, again, the news being negative after that tragic story having another tragic story. I'll tell you about people who got killed by the weather and injury in sports. And in local news, not much was happening, so we drove a news van around until we hit a pedestrian. So again, isn't the news just always negative? I guess I can see the observation. Maybe a precursor to an anti-media attitude. It's kind of weird because a lot of these are real good criticisms, but when you live in a world where the media, for all its faults, has been undermined to the point of complete distrust in it, I have this instinct to be defensive of the media, even though I know these are real observations. By the way, I thought it was funny when it says, well, it's not funny that they tried to run someone over, but they said there was no news, so we just drove a van around until we did that. The local news up here apparently didn't have much to talk about, so they went around in our community. They put up a social media post asking for examples of flooding as the snow melted. And so they were just trying to make up a story about that. And so they just had this lady go stand in a big puddle, essentially. And they found this one church that their parking lot got flooded because it had bad drainage. And she just talked to the guy about how people had trouble driving in and out of their parking lot. So I just thought this thing about making up news because there was no news was a little funny, having had that experience. Here, I took a picture of this. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. There's a weird green stripe on the side, too. That's weird. But just a bunch of men at work daydreaming about one of their female coworkers. And that's kind of gross. And this just takes it lightly. Is, again, this kind of boys will be boys attitude. By the way, one thing strange that I forgot to mention, with all the panels about women and Dilbert going on dates and kind of that whole incel thing this has going on, there were a lot where Dilbert would just kind of casually pick people up from work for dates or, you know, try to get dates while he was at work. And it's just kind of strange how this takes it for granted and treats that kind of casually. I don't think you're generally just supposed to go around asking out your coworkers, right? Here, Dilbert asked Dilbert, do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Of course. Then how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that the free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is, but it's a part of the brain that's just out there kind of being free. So you're saying free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Obviously, otherwise we wouldn't blame people for anything they do. Do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up. So this one, I guess, didn't have any really specific opinion. I just thought there was some interesting philosophy in it, and it was fun that Scott Adams decided to tackle that. Obviously, the question of free will is complex. You don't need to have anything floating out there in order to have free will. And you don't even have to really philosophically agree with free will in order to just recognize that functionally you have to hold people accountable. But I'm not going to sit here and take him to task for how he addresses the nitpicky aspects of all that. I just thought it was interesting. Here's a series of strips that I thought was pretty interesting, especially seeing Adams as like a proto-MAGA character, because there's a young girl here who I would consider essentially Greta Thunberg, if I'm pronouncing her name right. So let's just see how Scott Adams treats her. She says, I can't wait to grow up and get out of school. Dilbert says, actually, Noriko, your generation will have to take classes and work full-time your whole lives, assuming any jobs exist. But on the plus side, television will have 1,000 channels. She says, that's it. Somebody's got to do something. Who the heck is running this planet? It's a total disaster. The environment is a mess. Crime and poverty everywhere. Who's responsible? Dilbert says, adults like him. Dilbert says, hi, Noriko, is something wrong? And she goes, duh. You adults have totally messed up the planet. Where's the accountability? You know our implied social contract. You take care of the kids, then we take care of you when you're old. That's how it's supposed to work. Dilbert says, and she says the deal is off. So you probably get where I'm coming from in terms of Greta. This is totally, you're destroying the earth. You're not leaving anything behind for the kids. You adults are ruining the planet for my generation. We kids have no power now, but I'm taking names. When we take power, we'll ship you all to a penal colony on Mars. He says there's no oxygen on Mars. Oh, now you learn to plan ahead. So you care about the environment of the place we're going to ship you to, but you don't care about this environment. It's all kind of clever and I like it. And I find it interesting that Adam seems to be on the side of a proto-Greta character. Also, I enjoy the whole thing about Mars, just considering Elon Musk's fixation with it. I don't know, no really direct opinion about the idea of colonizing Mars as such, but it feels like an interesting coincidence. So this continues, and basically they get Bob the dinosaur to give people wedgies, I guess, on her behalf. I'm not going to read this whole thing. And it culminates in this strip where she stops the boss and says, "Stop right there, Mr. Adult. You've got some explaining to do to my generation." The boss says it's quite simple, really. Children have no political power, so we adults can plunder the planet, run up huge debts, then die fat and happy. She says, "I've never seen anybody lifted by his briefs and spun in the air like that." Bob says, "That's my twirling wedgie." So we continue, giving wedgies out as punishment to adults who are irresponsible. And the opinion on this is pretty clear, considering the boss just comes out and says, "We just don't care about children because you have no power and we're going to do what we want." So I thought this whole strip was interesting. It's one of those things where Scott Adams might come up with this opinion independently, but once you get somebody like Greta Thunberg out there and she gets marked as an anti-MAGA or, anti-global warming figure or whatever, would he have come to the same opinion? And in general, does the same kind of independent thinking Scott Adams, who came up with all the different mesh of ideas in this strip, would he still come up with those ideas today? Or would he fall in line with the very defined, with us or against us MAGA thinking? I really don't know. It's probably a nuanced question. I don't know if there's a real black or white answer. All right, here, Dilbert comes up, I guess, with an alternative medicine as the big picture thrust behind this one. He says, "I've identified the brain chemical that controls happiness, and I found the exact mix of fruit and vegetable juices that stimulate its production. Do you realize what this means?" Dilbert says, "Yeah, fruits and vegetables will be banned by the government." "We're the government. We came to confiscate your so-called happiness drug." Dilbert says, "It's not a drug. It's just a mixture of fruits and vegetables that makes you feel happy. You can't outlaw good nutrition." The agent says, "I guess that wouldn't make sense, would it?" And the other guy says, "Ignore him. He's a new guy." So, typical government overreach thing. Also, I think an earlier strip, I don't know if I read it, had criticized alternative medicine and folk cures. This one has kind of a RFK vibe where it thinks, these kinds of cures are out there and the government just stops you from using them. This felt a little bit like considering Adams's skepticism on some, kind of weird kooky issues, this felt a little out of character for him and not in a good way. All right, here, Dogbert and Ratbert are filming a TV show. Ratbert has his own channel. Now that cable TV has 1,000 channels, they're desperate for original programs. Couple sitting on the couch. The guy says, "Back in the 600s, I saw a rat slapping his head to a Barry Manilow tune." She says, "That's worth a second look." So no real, strong opinion here, but I just find this interesting as a product of its time, just because, number one, there's the whole cable thing. We don't have cable anymore. But this feels like a precursor to YouTube and online content creation where everybody can make anything. I just found that kind of interesting, the combination of different forms of media from different eras seeming to merge a little bit and maybe just predict what was coming in the future. All right, and our last view from Casual Day has gone too far. Here the boss says, "I want to assure you that any rumors you've heard are false. We are not planning to relocate the company to the South Pole where easily trainable native Eskimos will replace you." Dilbert says that's good because there aren't any Eskimos at the South Pole. The boss says, "Excuse me, I have to make a phone call." So the joke here is that the boss doesn't know the North Pole from the South Pole, or that native Eskimos live in the North, not the South. But especially as an Alaskan, I see this as a little ugly. This almost views the natives as animals that are, easily trainable, quote unquote. Also, using Eskimo as a general term for natives up here, as I understand it, is kind of the equivalent of the N-word. So don't do that. It's just weirdly insensitive. Aside from the use of the word, which I don't think, maybe it's not always considered that offensive. And a lot of people outside of Alaska aren't going to know that. But this whole thing of treating them as easily trainable creatures that they could find to replace their workers, I just found really gross. And then here's a short storyline where they're like leasing cubicles out to prisons so that prisoners can live in there. The running joke is basically that the prisoners are going to be treated better than the employees because prisoners have it worse than employees, and they also have a better health plan. That's definitely not true. I can see the exaggeration, I guess, being made that, boy, everything's really rough for workers. But there's just something a little gross in continuing this whole canard that, people in prison have it good and their conditions are unsuitably good for what they've done. And also they have good health care. Living in a prison is an absolute nightmare. And our prison system is broken and, punishes people for a lot of things that they shouldn't be punished for, and does that often on racial lines. And so, I don't know. I remember growing up this whole thing about how prisoners have it really good and they get cable TV in their cells and they get to eat steak and lobster and all that stuff. I've heard steak and lobster is a criticism of the military now. I think those are just two words you bring up whenever you want to say people are spending too much money on something, I guess. But this was a weird strip. It's a strange combination of critiquing working conditions and also just making a weird comment on prisons and prisoners. Here's one. I don't want to read this whole thing because it's kind of long, but basically I enjoyed this whole thread because it was Dogbert essentially becoming Rush Limbaugh. And he just basically becomes hateful and abuses his listeners. And the last line is Crimea River liberal because he doesn't want mankind to become extinct. So considering you kind of put Scott Adams in a right-wing box, this feels like a strange little strip here. And it's not just Rush Limbaugh and the talk radio at the time of this strip. I think this is the same kind of thing that turned into the whole anti-intellectual, own the libs, mean-spirited conservative, just trash culture of podcasters and our current government, to be frank. And it's interesting to see him critiquing it. And then here's I guess, Dilbert just listening to it in his car. Welcome to the Dogbert Show. Today I talk about getting government off our backs. I dream of a world where someday you can buy liquor, cigarettes, and firearms at a drive-through window and use them all before you get home. Basically, anything that gets rid of people is okay with me, but before you go, buy my new book. So essentially, continuation of the same idea. It's, I guess, criticizing talk radio hosts and that whole mentality behind them. There's an ultra-libertarian thing there that I think they're making fun of. And it includes America as a place where you just buy guns and, use them up before you get home. We go around shooting everything. Isn't that weird? So what do we make of this? I looked at and commented on a lot of comics, and I don't know if this was a little bit aimless, if I was, like I said before, at 100%, because I'm not feeling really great today. And I'm sorry if my voice is making a lot more clicks and gross noises. The sinuses keep popping when I'm talking. But I don't know. Scott Adams is kind of a weird guy. I don't know what to do other than to reiterate what I'd said before, which is he seems to have some actual real opinions that vary, and there is something refreshingly sincere in that. He seems to really believe what he believes, and if he gets an itch about something, he needs to scratch it by expressing that opinion, whether it is generally associated with the left or the right. But maybe what we're looking at here is that number one, maybe there wasn't the same dichotomy where you had to fall to the left and the right as much back then as there is today. So expressing different opinions was more viable and something someone was more likely to do. And maybe once MAGA arose, he shuffled a little more toward that side. Who knows? I'm not a scholar of his entire life expression outside of having read a lot of comics. And also, maybe a lot of these opinions, didn't fall along the same political lines as they used to. And maybe that factors into how I read these and how they come off to me today. There's the whole party switch that happened with Democrats and Republicans in the 20th century. And there seems to be this perception that they reversed, and they largely did on a lot of social issues. But when the Republicans were a little more on the pro-minority side, like they were more supportive of Black people and anti-slavery and stuff like that, they were the big business side of government or side of politics. And so not all of the issues aligned in the same way that they do now, where the Republicans are the racists and also big business. Not everything fully reverses. And so maybe some of the issues that Scott Adams has side by side weren't as incongruous back then as they seem now. I don't know. It was an interesting glance earlier into the mind of somebody who turned out a certain way. And I always wonder what gets people into a MAGA mindset now. What radicalizes them? What were they like before they were radicalized? Why did they change? Did anything change, or just did the culture they were in and how it allowed or encouraged them to express themselves shift and a different side of them came out? I really don't know, but maybe part of it just goes to show you can't put all of any group of people, including all of MAGA, into a single box. And I don't mean to minimize the fact that they are horrible and they're willing to be shitheads. I think that commonality is definitely there. That is an identifiable strand of what makes MAGA what they are, a willingness to be horrible to certain kinds of people and to blame certain people for problems. But that doesn't mean that in all areas of their life and even in all their opinions, they're one stamped out template. So I keep saying I don't know what to make of this, and I guess that's my ultimate conclusion. This was one of my not scripted videos, and it was a little off the cuff, and so I don't know really how all my thoughts tied together. I guess I'll learn a lot about this project and myself in editing. Next time, I'm going to be doing a more scripted, more structured video about the movie The Birth of a Nation, and I have a lot of thoughts about that. I've already been working on that quite a bit. But for now, I hope you got something from this. At the very least, a look back at Scott Adams's work. I don't like him. I don't mind saying that, despite the fact that he's passed. And I cannot abide the way he talked about Black people and just his being a racist and being MAGA. But there's a lot more of a person in there. And looking back at his work just kind of shows that to you in a really interesting way. So anyway, have a good day, everybody.